No worries. Thank you so much, Stacey. Well, it's lovely to be here with you, Andrew, Jane and Joy. My name's Leanne O'Shea and I live in WA. I live in the southwest of WA in a town called Boyanup, just out of Bunbury. But the work that I do is national. I do a lot of work around Australia, and my role is a end-of-life grief and bereavement counsellor. And I think we've got Sam joining us. And so the work that I do is I work at the Busselton Hospice, and I support those at the hospice as well as support the community in their grief and bereavement. I also do a lot of work for MND WA and MND Queensland in supporting families through the journey of MND. I also do a lot of community work and crisis response in our community to tragic events in our community. As an example, last night I spent some time in a community of Pemberton supporting those that have recently lost a community member through a tragic accident. I'm also the Vice Chair of the Southwest Compassionate Communities Network. And what is a compassionate community and what's the work that we do is we actually educate the community on grief and death literacy. And it's an important conversation that we need to all share in. Is it a difficult conversation? Absolutely, but it's a very, very important one. And I recently held a state forum and we had 200 people attend, and that forum had speakers from all over the world. And it was such a huge success. And a forum like this has never been held before. And when I reflect back over why this forum works so well, is because for the very first time, we had 200 community members come together and they could all relate, connect, and emotionally experience the importance of this conversation. Have they ever done it before? No. So the feedback that we've received is quite incredible. And what they've gone and done in the community from that forum is to develop a compassionate community in whatever small way that they can. So I really value my work, and it's an honour to work in this space. I see the difference that it makes on a daily basis. And I've come to realise that as Western culture, we don't do it very well. We try and avoid it at all costs. But what I share with a lot of my families and a lot of my clients and community members is that in one's lifetime, we're going to experience 1,000 sorrows and 1,000 joys. They go together. We can't have one without the other. Joy and sorrow go together. Life and death go together. We can't have one without the other. We are all going to die. So it's important that we know how to have the conversation. And what I found with my work with the MND families is, do they want to walk with me into the discomfort of this conversation? No. But 99.9% of the time is when they do take that journey with me, they step into the comfort, they find the comfort and the understanding and the awareness and the acknowledgement of why it's so important. So I've obviously got a fair bit to share with you, but I want for you guys to also contribute. So does anyone have any questions in regards to the work that I do or anything that I've shared so far?
I should just clarify, I have muted everyone because we do get some background noise sometimes. It's a bit of a distraction. So if anyone has any questions, you will need to unmute yourselves first.
Can I ask, is it very difficult and uncomfortable for you to have a conversation around grief and bereavement and end of life? Maybe put your hand up. Andrew, were you putting your hand up? You're on mute.
No, I wasn't. I mean, I know I found it very difficult. I mean, I'm a bit different from other people here, but I found it very difficult when I first was diagnosed.
Absolutely. And I think what's really important to know is grief is a very natural response to loss. It's actually a very important emotion. And within our community and our culture, we've sort of learnt to suppress emotions, but all emotions are important. There's no such thing as a negative or a positive emotion. We need to relearn how to be comfortable with all emotions. And grief is a very normal response to loss. And that loss can be loss of a job, loss of finances, loss of health, loss of independence, loss of self-worth, loss of a job, loss of a marriage, and of course, loss through death. And we experience grief because we loved. If we loved that job and we find ourselves unemployed, the experience, the emotional experience and the response is grief. If we were happily married for 40 years and we didn't see the divorce coming, the response is grief. There's no hierarchy in grief. Everyone responds very differently. Everyone responds in a different time frame, and all their response is very different and unique to themselves. And there's two grieving styles that I want to talk about that may help you better understand your family members, your community and neighbours or work colleagues. And that is, there's two grieving styles. There's the instrumental grieving and the intuitive grieving. And what's the difference between the two? Well, they generally say the instrumental grieving is how he grieves, and the intuitional grieving is how she grieves. And the instrumental is that a lot of men, they just need to go and do something. They need to build something, go to the shed, plan ahead, work things out. They're doers. They need to do things to work through their emotion. But the intuitive grievers, they want to express and feel and talk and connect and come together and talk it through again and understand it and explore it and express it. So as you can see, just by understanding the two different grieving styles, and then you've got a blend of the both, is that everyone does grieve very, very differently. And just because someone's not expressing emotions, that doesn't mean that they're not grieving. And of course, what we see a lot with MND is that anticipatory grief, is that we all know that, you know, with the deterioration of the disease, is that grief is a very natural process as we're adapting to the change. And we're always adapting to change, and nobody likes change. So of course, that grief response. What I've also found with my work, which is very, very important, and it's making a huge difference, the work that I do in the hospice, as well as the work that I do in the community and with MND, is the pre-grief work. The families that I work with that are willing to step into that discomfort and acknowledge their grief pre-death makes a huge difference to the post-grief. Quite an incredible difference, actually. And that's because the carers, the family members are also adjusting to change on a daily basis. And it's what we call micro losses. They're starting to identify how life is changing very quickly. And it could be that they can no longer go for a Sunday walk with their husband, and husband's not there to fix things or to change a light bulb. They're micro losses, all the little things that for 30 or 40 years, they were just a part of our day and a part of our subconscious because it was just a part of your routine. But as life is changing very quickly and you're going from a role as wife to carer, we're starting to grieve what we had and what is no longer. So acknowledging and working through and understanding and expressing, you know, the anticipatory grief, the micro losses, and becoming aware of the changes in our role, the changes in our relationship, and the changes in our daily lifestyle, which then brings us to the importance of, you know, compassionate fatigue, self-care. There are many layers to taking care of ourselves through very difficult times and very emotional times, but through developing awareness and understanding. Like I shared earlier, through stepping into the discomfort, we learn so much about ourselves and others. By stepping into the discomfort, we develop awareness. And through awareness, we develop the tools, the resources, the support that is going to make everyday life just that little bit easier. Does anyone have any questions?
Not yet.
Joy, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. I don't have anything at the moment, thanks. I'm just having a bit of fun with my sound, but working on it. But I can hear most of what you're saying. Thank you.
No worries at all. Is it helpful what I'm sharing? Is it
It
related?
Is. It is. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think it's just I guess it's useful to have somebody, you know, and you recognise that that's what's going on. But I think probably just acknowledging it out loud is probably useful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what I find with a lot of the MND families that I work with, is that initially, do they want to talk to Leanne and work with Leanne and step into that relationship? Probably not, no. But after the first session, second or third session, they are forever grateful that they were able to really pivot in their journey with MND, because they have a deeper understanding and they've got someone walking with them that really understands the other layers of what they're experiencing. And certainly for carers, there's many people involved in this journey with you, and everyone needs to be considered. My role in compassionate communities is exactly that every person, our mission really is that every person and every family and every community knows what to do when someone is grieving, caring, or dying. And if we go back generations before us, grieving was a very community process, a community ritual, a community event. Now, if we develop a compassionate community, I shouldn't be in a job. And really that's our goal, because grieving is a very natural, normal and important process. So we need to relearn that as a community, and that's the work that we do with compassionate communities. We've also, as I was sharing with you earlier, we hosted a state forum. We had 3 schools involved in that program, and the displays and the talks that those schools did was absolutely incredible in demonstrating a compassionate school. We had a 12-year-old girl get up and share on stage in front of 200 people the loss of her brother. And when she went to school, no one would mention his name and no one would acknowledge her pain and her grief. They avoided it at all costs. So a 12-year-old wrote a letter to her principal and shared with her principal why it was very important to talk of her brother and to talk about her grief and her pain. She's developing a compassionate school. We also do a lot of work with compassionate workplaces and developing a better understanding, whether it's a community tragedy or a death of a work colleague. Like I shared earlier, our culture generally avoids it at all costs, but it's the one thing that we are all going to experience, yet we don't know how to do it. So, that's why I find it a privilege to do the work that I do in many capacities. And that's why I'm here today, is that I'm volunteering my time today to connect with you all and just share with you the work that I do with MND, the benefits and the positive change that we are supporting those with MND, and just here to answer any questions that you have.
Did everyone want to unmute themselves so that we can see if anyone's got some questions for Leanne?
No, listening intently.
What was that?
Listening to every word.
That's lovely. Is there anything else that you want me to touch on, Stacey?
I guess I'd really rather see if there's anything that anyone in the group wants you to talk about. Is there anything that you're finding particularly challenging within your own families that Leanne might be able to help us with?
How do you manage it when people are dealing with the loss or an anticipated loss at different levels. So, for example, somebody with a problem and their spouse may be not on the same page, or I often used to find when talking to parents about their sick child that their responses would be different, and the differences might lead to difficulties in them understanding their spouse's point of view.
Yeah, that is so common, Andrew. I do a lot of family mediation and facilitate conversations with families. And again, generally what happens is they'll say, Leanne, it's not going to work. They're going to walk out of the room. They're not going to communicate. It's going to be a mess. But that never happens. And the only reason that I think that that doesn't happen is because there's someone else in the room. And because they have to actually contribute and behave, if that's what you want to call it, they contribute in a different way. They listen in a different way, and they share their truth or communicate in a much better way, where it allows the family to better understand when someone else is facilitating the conversation. Because we see it in all community family groups. In all family groups, there's difficulties in communication and many levels of communication. I'm pretty sure that I find that everyone's desire and outcome is the same. But like I shared with you earlier, the different grieving styles impacts the way that we communicate. And then the communication is misinterpreted, or assumptions are made. And so communication is a whole nother subject that we can talk about. Yeah, but it's a finding ways and engaging support if it's really important to you. And I think that, you know, the end of life conversations that I have with families, as difficult as they are, it is a real turning point. It really does allow them to pivot in the way that they all come together and transition through that process. And it's an important process that they transition through together. Otherwise, it can cause more problems on the other side.
So Leanne, you talked obviously about the benefit in terms of that transition process and the impact that has after somebody has passed away. Not all of our clients have the benefit of accessing somebody with your level of expertise that can facilitate some of those conversations. So what advice would you give to families about how they might engage in those conversations? What are the key topics they should be talking to each other about to prepare for that?
Yeah, sure. Advanced care planning, you know, is a will in place? What are their wishes? I take it obviously further in regards to, you know, exploring their fears, their understanding, and, you know, what death looks like for them, what they want their family to know, what families want to talk about. Probably most of the time, it's family members wanting to say something, but not quite sure how to approach it. And it's simply just having someone there that gives them the courage. So in the hospice, when I work in the hospice, that's predominantly a lot of the work that I do. So I'll spend some time one-on-one with a family member, and they'll share with me what's really important for them to share. And I guide them, and they find the courage, and they breathe through it, and they speak those words. And it can be either sharing something from the past, a memory, or sharing something with them, or simply saying, I love you. And they say it, and then they come to me just crying, saying, Leanne, I just cannot thank you enough. It was a very special moment, and I thought it was going to be difficult, but it was actually a very, very important, special moment that I'll treasure forever. So sometimes it's the very simple things, but in those times of such great difficulties, that it's very, very hard. And to know that you have developed that self-worth of contributing, you know that you've made such a difference in their life path, in their post-grief, their own awareness of themselves, their own awareness of death and dying. So hopefully through that support, they'll go into their community and start developing a compassionate community, a deeper understanding. I hope that's helped.
Yeah, thank you. Conscious I don't want to dominate the conversation. I do have some more questions, but does anyone else have anything that they wanted to ask Leanne?
My experience is that acute hospital settings don't do this well.
Sorry, what was that, Andrew? Do you want to?
My experience is that acute hospital settings don't do this well.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what, you know, I do hear this a lot, is that the health sector aren't giving them that support. But what I've come to realise that they're so busy. And so at our Busselton Hospice, we have 80 volunteers. I think that's just remarkable. 80 volunteers that are trained and provide that support. So we have 4 volunteers on shift at any one time to be available to those families. And, you know, within the hospice, we also offer bereavement support. We offer complementary therapies. So there's a range of programs that, like you just said, Andrew, is that we're providing that gap that's missing. And that's the work that Compassionate Communities is doing also, is trying to meet that gap through the community support. So it's what we call a city charter. And Albany and WA are leading the way in a city charter, and we're trying to develop one now in our region. And a city charter is where a compassionate community is recognised and embedded in the city council. And so it's an approach of partnering with the health department to provide this care, this very much needed care, and this very much education and awareness that's required. We have a community connector program where we train volunteers to go into the homes of those with an advanced illness or who are dying, to support them. And it could be simply just working with the Lions Club to bring in a load of wood. It could be just taking them to their doctor's appointment once a week. It could be just bringing in meals. It could be just sitting with them and being a listening ear. But the difference that that program has made to our community, not only by fulfilling the needs of our community volunteers and feel that they're contributing back to their community, but we're demonstrating that that partnership between the health department and community can absolutely work.
So Leanne, one of the questions that we always get, and this is coming from informal carers rather than from people with motor neurone disease, is that informal carers feel a need to put their own needs on the back burner, because there's a sense that they're being selfish if they focus on that anticipatory grief and those micro losses you mentioned that they're experiencing every day, and that the priority needs to be about supporting their loved one, who at the end of the day, they're the person that have had the MND diagnosis. Well, how would you respond to that kind of comment?
I do respond to this a lot, and what I share with them is grief is expressed in so many different ways, and it can affect every part of our life. So it can affect us emotionally, our thoughts, our physical health, our beliefs, our values, our sense of self, and certainly in these circumstances, our sense of identity, our relationships, and our relationships with others. But the one that I want to touch on is that our physical health, and this is what I share a lot with carers, is that if we don't implement self-care and some value for ourselves, our physical health is going to deteriorate, and then we're going to be no good to anybody. And so grief will always respond, but if we're not expressing it emotionally and verbally, then we're going to hold it physically. So what I say to a lot of people is that we have to step into the discomfort, and when we walk through it, we feel lighter, we feel better, we feel like we can refocus, we feel like we can readjust. But if we don't, and we suppress it, we see it time and time again. And a lot of the work that I do in clinic is really, I don't do a lot of work with the cognitive or the emotions. I do a lot of body-based work, because that's where we store our feelings. There's a wonderful book called The Body Keeps Score. And if we don't take care of our physical response to stress, or our physical response to the emotions of grief, and change is a big one when we're adapting to caring for a loved one with an illness, then we're going to find that we become physically unwell also. So that's what I really focus on, is really identifying the emotions and how we play those emotions out physically. Yeah, so that's what I focus on. And then they just develop a natural understanding of why it's so important to take care of themselves.
And I guess then the other question is really around those people that do have a terminal diagnosis. So we talk about the fact that you only die once, and the importance of living until that happens, and that focus on quality of life and enjoying that time that you have with loved ones. But then also recognizing that it's important to think about what you want at a funeral, for example. So what are your thoughts on that funeral planning and the benefits or disadvantages of doing that, and when should it happen if you do it?
Yeah, thank you, Stacey. You've just reminded me of something else I want to share. So I will come back to that, but this is important, is that what's really important with grief, anticipatory grief, grief of the loss of anything, it's really important that we step into the grief, the sorrow, and it's just as important to step back into life. So if you see it as the scales, sometimes they're not going to be balanced, and that's okay. And certainly upon diagnosis, that scale is definitely going to be out of balance. And that's important, and it's very, very normal. But to ensure that, you know, our grief is a healthy response, we always need to come back to that balance of stepping back into life and engaging in our daily activities, but also very much honouring and acknowledging our grief. So it's the same with, you know, the anticipatory grief. It's important to step into those difficult conversations and talk about your wishes, and talk about the funeral plan, talk about the advanced care planning, you know, talk about the family fears and concerns. But it's also important to step back into the hope and the joys and, you know, the daily moments of just being with family and being here to enjoy watching the sunrise. So if we can balance out those both, it comes together really beautifully. But in regards to funeral planning, is that, you know, you see such a mixture all the time. And for the ones that have the terminal illness, it's not my worry, not concerned, do whatever you want. But I find that the ones that are left behind, it is really important to them, because in their grief, they really want to get it right. And the pain and sorrow of grief adds to, you know, their heartache and despair of not knowing what to do. So again, those conversations, those very important conversations, make it a lot easier on everyone. And it can also be very enjoyable, because you start to share stories, and stories are very important in acknowledging pain, because everyone has a story. And if, as a family, as you start to come together and talk about death and dying, you start to talk about memories and life and stories, and family members get to learn about each other that they haven't done before, because they haven't engaged in these conversations. So, you know, obviously I talk about that a lot, because I see the difference that it makes. I see the difference when families with MND that are well organised and forward plan and step into the sorrow, they actually find that they step into more joy, because it opens up more conversations. They are storytelling, they are planning, they are looking for the future. And then I find families that avoid it at all costs. And when they avoid it at all costs, it brings more pain in the future. And that's just an observation through the client work that I've done, is that when you step into the discomfort of all the planning that's required, it does make a huge difference.
Is there evidence that these sorts of interventions decrease the risk of the increased mortality in the surviving spouse or partner?
Sorry, Andrew, I just want to understand your question.
Well, the question is, after the death of a spouse, for any reason, there is an increased risk of death in the surviving spouse. And I'm just wondering, do these sorts of interventions mitigate against that?
Stacey, can you share that with me? I'm not quite sure that I understand.
What I understand from what Andrew's asking is that we hear these stories of when a husband and wife passes away, then their spouse follows fairly shortly afterwards. So there is that increased mortality in the surviving spouse, or the reduced life expectancy, I guess. So
Yeah.
Is there evidence that this intervention and this preparation for the loss of the loved one addresses that?
Absolutely, and I see this all the time, not just in MND, is that, you know, they've been married for 40, 50, 60 years. And like I shared with you, those micro losses is that they have lived a routine, a pattern of living for a very, very long time, and all of that's very much unconscious. And so, you know, when certainly in those older years, you know, 70 and over, trying to adapt to a routine of life in a house that's very lonely and isolated. And like I shared with you before, the physical health deteriorates very, very quickly. Where if we plan in regards to those social and emotional supports and identify our support network, and again, this is the work that we do with compassionate communities, because research has shown that loneliness, you can die, more people die from loneliness than they do from cigarette smoking. So that in itself demonstrates why we have a huge responsibility in developing a compassionate community. So the work that we do here at the hospice ensures that that group within our community has somewhere to go. So this week I hosted a support group, a women's support group in our community for that age group. And, you know, the difference that it's making just through connection. Again, they didn't really need me. They just needed me to create that space for them to come together. And now the work that they're doing and contributing back to the community. So when I hold support groups, we don't sit around in circles. We re-engage back in our community. So with the men's group, we go to the museum, we go for coffees in the afternoon, and it's re-engaging them with how to interact with their community rather than just staying home and isolating themselves. So there's a lot of work that we need to do in that space, because they do deteriorate quickly because they don't know how to move forward, because they've known one life and one life only, and that's with their partner.
So what do you see in terms of the role of a counsellor in that post, or in that grieving process post the loss of a loved one? So we're often asked for the names of counsellors with experience in MND. Do you, from your experience, is a grief counsellor a grief counsellor, or do they need to have that specific expertise around a terminal illness, so that process through that anticipatory grief?
Yeah.
Or can anyone provide that support? And how do you choose a good counsellor? How do you know who's a good fit?
That's the most important part, is that, yes, absolutely, you can see any counsellor, but it's making sure that the connection and the relationship of trust is there. So that's first and foremost. What we have found, though, that unless they're specifically trained in end of life and grief and bereavement, they generally just go through the stages of grief and don't really sort of, you know, explore it in depth and really allow people to express it and understand the emotional response. So you know, my recommendation through my own experience is that it's best to seek out someone experienced. But the reason why I actually moved to specialise in this field is because when I was in my general counselling practice, I recognised that in everyone's story there was grief. Loss of relationship, loss of job, loss of finances, loss of a limb, loss of health, and so on. And that's what I recognise, that we're not doing enough work in this space to better understand the importance of the response of grief. It's not a disease, it's not an illness, it's not mental health. It's a very important response, and we need to relearn that in our community. And so seeking professional support can make a huge difference. But what I also find is that when people come for grief support due to the loss of a loved one through death and dying, generally there is layers of family history, or there's layers of trauma, of layers of events that contribute to where they are today. So it's not just the grief of a lost loved one, there's other layers to it, to why they've actually come to this stage in their life where they really need help. And generally it's the death of someone that opens that up.
Okay, I have one last question. This one's more of a question for me as the manager of services. So we're always trying to ensure that our services at MND Queensland are tailored to the needs of our community. And one of the things that we're working on is how do we maintain a community after somebody has lost their loved one to motor neurone disease. We're quite conscious that there is a point in time when that individual has gone through a really difficult time, and to some extent they really don't want the reminder of MND and don't necessarily want us in their lives maybe immediately afterwards. What's your view of the role of an association like ours?
I found it a little bit different in that because they were so connected to the association, they found them to be like family. And if it's cut off so quickly, they feel that they've lost again. So that's like a double loss. And so, you know, that support. So, you know, WA have done some wonderful work in providing the grief support that they receive, implementing the grief support program. So we've just delivered our pilot program, and we had 12 from Queensland and WA in the online support group. And again, you know, I facilitated the group, but because they've all experienced the loss of a loved one to MND, they really drove that support group. And there's some really beautiful stories that have come out of how they connected outside of the group and have supported each other, and just having the familiarity and really understanding the emotions and, you know, what it takes to care for someone with MND has made such a huge difference. And so those two I've identified that really have made a difference, because I found that they really want to talk about not only their loss, but they want to talk about the experience of MND. And so staying connected to their MND family helps. But there does come a point where it's time for them not to become dependent. And so what we do here at the hospice, and what I'm working with MND WA, is sort of like an exit program, is identifying and making sure that they have the resources and, you know, they're aware of what's available in their community, and, you know, that the measures are in place to ensure that they're doing okay. And so it's sort of like a formal way of, you know, finishing the relationship rather than just no contact at all. It gives them the opportunity to explore their needs and for us to identify how we can support them.
Thank you for that. Simone, I think I jumped in ahead of you before. Were you going to ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, Leanne.
Hello.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your presentation, sorry. But I just wondered if you touched on how to actually start conversations with the M&D client that has young children. or even grandchildren?
So sharing with the children and the grandchildren about the diagnosis?
Yeah, yes, and then in turn, you know, the implications of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, I only shared this last night because I ran a workshop in a community that have, you know, gone through a tragic loss. So I spoke to 100 people last night, and that is that children are incredible. You know, they don't have the pattern of behaviour that we do. And so they want honesty. They want to talk about it. But then 5 minutes later, they'll come and show you what they've just made out of Lego. So we don't want our fear to become their fear. We don't want our pain to become their pain. So, you know, anything that lives dies. A plant, a flower, an insect, an animal. So it's about understanding the natural process of life. And then obviously just to share little snippets. So some families that I work with MND that have children, the children can see that life is changing on a daily basis. And although that's very slow, therefore the communication and the understanding with the children can be very slow. So they only need very little bits, that they prefer the honesty, because they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to go and play with my Barbie now. And if mum's crying, it's okay to say mum's upset today, rather than trying to hide it. So what I've found with the work that I do with families and children is that honesty is the best key. I hope that helps, but I'm very happy to be.
That's great, thank you. Yeah. I also wondered, just, you know, kids do like honesty, but then sometimes how do we react to that? And should they not be showing some grief, you know, so then...
Should they not be shown grief?
Well, no, because we're grieving,
yep,
and they're not, then that just poses a few additional questions, I guess, or...
You know, look, every scenario is very different and the family dynamics are very different, and generally it's more about, it's not the children that are the concern, it's the parents that are the concern, only because we've been conditioned over 50, 60 years that really I think it's through demonstration. And like I shared earlier in the call, is that we need to relearn in society that all emotions are important. There's no such thing as a negative or a positive emotion. And so if we can openly share emotions with our children and let them know that they're important, and it's okay that I'm crying, it's okay that I'm having a sad day, it's okay that mum's just spending the day in her PJs. So it's about being the demonstration, and it's just through connection. And like I said earlier, children are curious and we are scared. And a lot of the times that we just don't know what to do, and we don't want to get it wrong, and we don't want to say the wrong things, but sometimes we just need to let go of all of that, because there is a beginning and an end to everything. And if we want to instill resilience in our children, then we need to start for them to understand, just as much as we need to learn in our community, the importance of grief, the importance of rituals, the importance of emotions, the importance of understanding that with loss comes grief. And if we don't step into it and suppress it, that's when problems arise later on in life, whether it's loss of job, loss of finances, loss of relationship, you know, addiction, health issues, and like I shared before, if the physical response. So there's a beginning and an end to everything. So when they witness our resilience, and when children witness our ability to step into the joys and the sorrows, and they witness both, like mummy was crying in the morning, but we've gone out and played in the sunshine in the park in the afternoon, they're starting to see the importance of both. There's no right or wrong. That's the most important. There's no right or wrong.
Thanks, Leanne.
Right, let's go around the group then and just check if anyone else has got any questions. Joy, did you want to ask anything?
Sorry, I'm just trying. No, I don't think I have any individual questions, and I'm sorry I did miss a piece of the meeting. I just had to go and do something for David, but I will get the recording and have a listen to it. But yeah, thanks, Leanne. I think, you know, hear all that you're saying, and it's just so true that we do need to actually deal with emotions. I think one of the, and it's never easy, particularly when you have partners or family who really don't, you know, the subject is taboo and you just keep it to yourself and, you know, toughen up, get on with life. So I guess it's encouraging to hear you sort of reinforce that we really do need to actually try and spread the word a little further. I suppose that it's all okay. So thank you, really appreciate it. So interested to follow up a bit further.
Thanks, Joy. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks so much, Stacey, for inviting me to share today. It's been an absolute joy to be with you all. And yeah, I'm sure we'll organise another one.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Leanne.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leanne. Sorry, I have a dog barking in the background to address before taking myself off mute. Look, it's been really, really interesting and useful. And I think that one thing that Leanne said to me before you all joined was that this is something of a work in progress. So it's useful to get a sense of what people are thinking now and then shape some information to be shared in the future. So Leanne, if that's still okay with you, we'd certainly like to take you up on an opportunity to revisit another session with the group in the future.
Very happy to.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nice to see you all and to hear some of you. Hope you found that useful, and I hope to see you at future groups.